It's been described as a strategic deal. China and Iran have signed a long-term agreement worth billions of dollars. But in a volatile region, what do both countries stand to gain? And what does it mean for the Middle East and beyond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It's been in the works since 2016 and dubbed a comprehensive strategic partnership. The deal signed between China and Iran is expected to boost their long-standing economic and political alliance. The cooperation would cover a wide range of Chinese investments in Iran's most important sectors, including energy and infrastructure. It's the first long-term agreement of its type to be signed by Iran with a major world power, and comes at a tough time for Iran's economy that's been devastated by U.S. sanctions. The pact was signed in Iran's capital, Tehran, on Saturday. That coincided with the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Iran. Well, China is Iran's long-standing ally and one of its largest trading partners. The two countries are believed to have shared an annual trade worth at least $20 billion in recent years. In 2016, Tehran and Beijing agreed to boost that more than tenfold to $600 billion over a decade. Now, both nations have strained relations with the U.S. and are under sanctions imposed by Washington. China's opponents say this cooperation deal aims to expand Beijing's economic and political influence in the Middle East. Tehran is hardening its stance towards the U.S. and the European signatories of the 2015 nuclear accord, and it's demanding U.S. lift sanctions before it holds talks to revive that deal. Well, the former President Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran in 2018. Now, China is a signatory, as are Russia, France, Germany, and the EU as a bloc. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has voiced his appreciation of Beijing's support for Tehran's position on that accord, saying cooperation between Tehran and Beijing is important for the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and Europeans' commitments to the deal and can change the existing conditions. Well, China says the cooperation deal with Iran does not target any country.
The plan focuses on tapping the potentials in economic and people-to-people cooperation between the two nations and making plans for long-term cooperation prospects and paths. It does not include specific quantified contracts or indicators, and it's not targeted at any third party. It is believed that this plan will provide a large-scale framework for future cooperation between China and Iran.
Let's now bring in our guest in Beijing. We have Einar Tangen, who's a political and economic analyst. In Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, a professor of political science at Tehran University. And joining us from Brussels is Theresa Fallon, who's the director for Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. Welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us on Inside Story. Theresa, by laying out this strategic plan with Iran, is China positioning itself as a great superpower and sending a message to the U.S., or is it coming to Iran's rescue with the nuclear deal hanging in the balance and the country suffering under U.S. sanctions?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Actually, we've seen a huge momentum growing. We saw Secretary of State Blinken's visits to Japan and South Korea as part of the revitalization of alliances, then the meeting in Anchorage between the Chinese and the U.S. the first time during the Biden administration. And that was quickly followed by Secretary of State Blinken's to NATO and then Lavrov's visit to China. So this is part of a growing narrative. At the same time, the EU imposed sanctions because of human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And then we saw it was very well coordinated because then the US, the UK, and Canada also had the same sanctions in regard to Xinjiang. So I think that this is part of a longer, wider narrative. I imagine that this agreement has been under negotiation for quite some time, but the significance of it being announced on Saturday in this momentous week of activity in regards to Russia, in regards to China and the U.S. kind of allying with various groups. And in addition to that, we saw the PRC Secretary of Defense traveling to Serbia, Hungary, North Macedonia, and Greece in order to kind of say that we will do defense cooperation with them. And also Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was in Turkey. All of this within the last week. So I think it's an incredible period. And China always says we don't like Cold War thinking, but it seems that China is trying to signal that they have these alliances. Iran has long been a key issue for them on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a good match. Iran, under sanctions, really needs new infrastructure and investment. It grabbed headlines, 400 billion. We don't know if that's real or not, but I mean, it would be some money up front for Iranian oil. And I think that it also kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into the JCPOA negotiations. The Biden administration has made it clear they would like to see some form of a concession from Iran before they begin further negotiations.
All right. Einar, Theresa is right when she says it's been negotiated for a couple of years, because this agreement was in fact proposed back in 2016 by China. And there was a draft of it that was leaked to the media last year. But why do you think it's gone ahead now?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, as Theresa mentioned, this has been a momentous week. Obviously, the key here is orchestration. The U.S. and its allies is, as Biden said he would, is trying to put together a gang of countries who are going to put China in its place. If you think about the parallels here, it's very clear that we're entering this kind of position of pre-World War I, when an ascendant Great Britain was concerned about a rising Germany and was making up all these alliances and things like that. In essence, trying to avoid war, they stumbled into it. And this is the worry that we have here. But I would take one issue with what Theresa said, and that is this idea that it's China engaging in Cold War thinking. She acknowledged that, and we've all said that this has been orchestrated on the U.S. side. The unilateral tariffs have not been withdrawn. Instead, there's almost a daily drumbeat of negative press of actions against Chinese officials, more piling on in terms of economics, delisting Chinese companies. This can't go on unanswered, and this idea that it's somehow China's fault that the U.S. is attacking it is, I think, a false narrative.
Theresa, I'll give you the chance to respond in just a moment, but first let's get the point of view from Iran. Hamid Mousavi, Iran is betting on China, ultimately. Is this going to be a good bet for Iran, and how are people inside the country viewing it?
So this is something very significant for Iran. Iran has been under intense pressure ever since Donald Trump came into power. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is also following the so-called maximum pressure campaign. So Iran's economy has been under a lot of pressure. And essentially, this agreement will give Iran breathing space against U.S. pressure. It will give some leverage in potential nuclear talks. But the long-term issue here is that Iran is signaling to the West that the more pressure they put on Iran, the more Iran will go to the eastern camp. And even right now in Iran, we have calls from the parliament that we should devise something similar with the Russians. So I think if this trend continues, then Iran will become very closely allied with the Russian and the Chinese in any future, if you'd say, confrontation against the United States. In Iran, there has been some criticism in the sense that Iran's revolutionary slogan over 4 decades ago was neither East nor West. So some people are criticizing and saying, why should we go into the Eastern camp? Or if we are putting that slogan aside, maybe it's better to join the Western camp. But nevertheless, this is something that has been clearly supported by Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. So it's not even only the government of Hassan Rouhani, but something much larger.
Theresa, go ahead and respond to what my guest from Beijing had to say about China sort of instigating Cold War. That's what you said. In fact, he disagrees with that. And also, to what extent do you think Washington is really going to be worried about this deal? Because Iran's supreme leader back in February said the post-US era has started. I mean, is this politicking, or is there some truth to that?
Well, I think there's a bit of a future bomb in that for Iran, because China's policies in Xinjiang might, the type of re-education camps, as the Chinese themselves have described them, this caused a lot of friction with other countries. And if Iran is willing to turn a blind eye to that and to get investment from China, this might cause problems further down the road. We saw with Wang Yi's visit in Turkey, there was huge protests against what China is doing in Xinjiang. In addition to, China has these agreements that they negotiate over time, and then they can actually agree to them finally at the most particular time in history where it has a maximum impact. We've seen that in Europe with the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment and EU-China Investment Agreement that was long negotiated for 7 years, 35 meetings, and it was agreed in principle on December 30th under Angela Merkel, who had the rotating European Council presidency. And German interests are largely in this agreement because of German car industry and other interests in China. So I think that China kind of kept it on low burner until it had maximum impact because the U.S. administration had said, wait, we're coming in. The new Biden administration was coming in. There was kind of a period of transatlantic drift under the Trump administration. And the Biden administration made it very clear it wanted to revitalize relations with allies. So by giving last-minute concessions, Xi Jinping stepped in, gave last-minute concessions to the Europeans in order to get this over the line, meant that in one sense, they were hoping to buy Europe's silence. And so I think that's why the counter-sanctions that China put on Europe showed the extent of their anger. So the sanctions that were put in place on Monday, the 22nd, were quickly followed the same day by counter-sanctions, which actually sanctioned members of the European Parliament, and the European Parliament must ratify this economic agreement. And by doing that, they've actually alienated them. So China has kind of overplayed their hand. They not only sanctioned European leaders, they also sanctioned the Political and Security Committee, which is made up of 27 EU ambassadors, and their families are included in that sanctioning. And they sanctioned an entire German think tank. So they want discourse power as well. They want to say, we don't like what you say about China, so we're going to sanction even an academic institution. In addition to that, they even sanctioned the head of a Swedish think tank. So I think they misunderstood Europe very much, because when you attack people who want independent academic inquiry into what's happening in China, or you have politicians who are asking what is happening in Xinjiang, and when you sanction them, this badly backfired because they're attacking freedom of speech and basic rule of law and even the very roots of democracy.
Well, speaking of sanctions, Einar, Tangen, I mean, there are sanctions on China. And there are sanctions on Iran, U.S. sanctions, that is. So how much of this deal can actually be implemented with these sanctions limiting how much business Chinese companies can actually conduct in Iran?
Well, they can conduct quite a bit. And with the digital yuan, it'll probably increase. Theresa has given a long narrative, kind of laundry list of things that she thinks are going on. I think from Beijing's point of view, the situation in Xinjiang, they see it completely differently. They see it as a necessary step and something that they've done in all parts of China, which is, in essence, to teach people the history and language so that they're not stuck in a backwater and unable to seek meaningful employment. China's the one who's been taking people out of poverty. They have not been, segregating people on the basis of who they are. They have driven
right,
up
but just allow me. I mean, Xinjiang is a topic that needs an entire different program. So let's just get back to the deal at hand, which is the deal between China and Iran.
Yeah, between China and Iran, it's a geopolitical shift. I would agree with my colleague from Iran. They are looking east. How long that will happen, I don't know. But the reality is that the money is moving east. Oil, energy is being used in Asia at far greater levels. The United States is, in essence, pretty much self-supplying as long as the price of oil is above 45 and they can use fracking. Europe is another matter. They're somewhere in between. But yes, this does give Iran breathing room. Hopefully, it will not be an excuse to continue with nuclear capabilities. That is not good for anybody. But there has to be a very clear and open stance on this thing. The fact it's the worst kept secret in the world that Israel has nukes, plenty of them, and is willing to use them in the case that they are overrun. So, I mean, at this point, it really, if there is going to be a denuclearization, if Iran, China, and the U.S. are going to start cooperating along with Russia and Europe, there has to be some absolute clarity here and stop with this kind of narrative that, you know, you're doing this and therefore I'm responding. I would agree that China is stuck in this kind of tit for tat response to the U.S. I don't think that that is going to solve anything. There has to be some more creative thinking and more thinking in terms of the international situation. You know, what's happening between these two powers is having an immense effect on the rest of the world and preventing, in many cases, you know, real progress being made on the, you know, pressing issues today of climate change and COVID-19.
And also the nuclear deal, which we'll get on in just a moment. But Hamid Mousavi, let me bring you in here. What does this agreement's success depend on? We don't know much, except that it's about $400 billion that's going to be spent over the next 25 years. The agreement includes the paving of roads, construction of ports, communications, as well as military cooperation. What do you make of the scant details that we know of it?
Right. So it was actually the Chinese who asked for the details to remain confidential. The speaker of Iran's government made clear that from the Iranian perspective, there was nothing secret about it. But from what we've heard from Iranian officials, the deal promises $400 billion of Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure. And this is supposed to happen in 25 years. Whether that will happen or not, we will have to wait and see. In return, China will get a steady stream of discounted Iranian oil. And I mean, even before this agreement, the Chinese are buying increasing amount of Iranian oil. Right now, they're buying almost 1 million barrels per day of oil. And this is in defiance of U.S. sanctions. So this is very good for Iran. Also, we're hearing that there's a lot of promises regarding defense and security cooperation between the two countries. And I think this is something very significant. Iran and China have a very deep economic relationship, almost to $20 billion per year of trade already. But in regards to defense and security cooperation, that has never happened before on a serious level. And if that actually materializes, then I think that is a big problem for the Americans, because that will make the Chinese more involved in the Middle East, and the Americans will have a potential powerful rival in the Middle East. As we saw, for example, in Syria, when the Russians entered the war, it really tipped the balance of power in that war. And I think China becoming more involved in the Middle East will be very bad for the Americans and potentially good for the Iranians.
What about the nuclear deal, Einar? Could Beijing be positioning itself to play a more central role when it comes to perhaps reviving the nuclear deal that the U.S. had pulled out of? And we know that China does support Iran.
Well, it supports the JCPOA. It is not supporting any kind of military alliance. I think that is a fallacy, and I am surprised that that's being pushed by my colleague in Iran. What they have said is there's a possible path to joining the SCO, but that's to combat terrorism, not to set up a defensive bloc. China has not entered into any kind of defense or agreements with any other countries. And there's good reason for that. They're not looking for a confrontation. So at this point, yes, China would be very interested in having the JCPOA put back in place. The difficulty that you have here is that Iran does not want to give any concessions other than going back to the basics. They're very suspicious of the U.S. and the U.S. Similarly. So right now, there's a huge trust deficit. I don't know that China will be able to mend that. But if there were a three-party, way of making sure that Iran sovereignty was respected, that might help move things along. But that would not be a unilateral. That would have to be a guarantee by all the major powers.
Theresa, to what extent does this deal between Iran and China perhaps undercut Washington's efforts to keep Iran isolated?
Well, I think that China has had a really good ride in the Middle East because they've diversified their energy resources. And so they receive oil from all players in the region, which is a smart strategy. And they've never been asked to choose sides. And as we know in the Middle East, it's very difficult to do that. And as China intensifies its relations with Iran with this deal, I mean, they even have a technological cooperation with Israel, which might be jeopardized. And, they're trying to balance Saudi interests, Iranian interests. And so far, they've been able to do that, saying, we're only interested in business. We don't want to get involved in any religious issues. But because of what's happening in Xinjiang, it might push the envelope a bit. So how can China continue to say we're only doing business and have no other role in the region will remain to be seen. I think the JCPOA, of course, was not a perfect agreement, but it was the best that could be agreed upon. And I really do hope that there will be some revitalization of that. The new Biden administration has said that they're quite interested in returning to it, but there are many obstacles to that.
Right,
and I
but
think
as we see, Iran is moving closer to China. Iran is moving closer to China with this deal. So that hope, could it fade? Is there any space left for issues to be resolved when it comes to the JCPOA?
Well, I think that Iran should be cautious because look what happened to Russia. If you only turn towards China, that gives them so much more leverage over you. So I think a wise strategy for Iran would be multiple partners, and not to just push themselves into a corner as what happened with Russia, because that gives Beijing far more leverage over them. And I think that a far smarter strategy would be to return to the JCPOA and at least have investment from other players, including Europe. And I think that would be a key strategy. I think, linking their cart only to the Chinese horse would be detrimental to their future.
Okay, Iran says that it is the United States that pulled out of the JCPOA, but Hamid Mousavi, I'll bring you in here because there is some reporting out of the U.S. That seems to suggest that the Biden administration is planning to put forward a new proposal to jumpstart those talks, perhaps even this week, and that may include a request that Iran halt some of its nuclear activities in exchange for some relief from U.S. sanctions. At this stage, and after signing this deal with China, is that something that Iran would accept, Hamid?
I think Iran still wants the JCPOA to work. Nevertheless, this agreement will make Iran less pressure to come back to the deal. But here's the issue regarding the JCPOA. The Biden administration has made clear that they want to renegotiate the deal. They want a so-called better deal. And when they say better, it means better for the Americans and more concessions from Iran. And Iran's position is that we are not going to renegotiate any part of the deal. I mean, the JCPOA was the result of several years of diplomacy. And just because the Americans withdrew doesn't mean that they can renegotiate it. The issue of trying to jumpstart it this week is that they are saying to Iran to stop enriching up to 20%, and in return, they will lift some sanctions. They haven't made clear which sanctions exactly. But from the Iranian perspective, that's a non-starter because Iran wants America to come back to the deal wholly. So they don't want just some sanctions to be lifted. They want all sanctions to be lifted. And in return, Iran will also fully oblige by its side of the deal. Nevertheless, the Biden administration has not been willing to do that thus far. This agreement with China is actually showing the Americans that Iran has other options. And I think this is something positive for Iran. And just to go back on the issue of military cooperation, when we say military cooperation, Iran's position is not a so-called defense pact with China, and Iran does not expect to go into war with the United States. I don't think anybody wants that. Nevertheless, I think in the long run, Iran can become closer to the Chinese, especially since they can't buy military equipment from most countries. They have no choice other than to rely on the Russian and on the Chinese regarding its military.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Thanks to my guests, Einar Tangen, Hamid Mousavi, and Theresa Fallon. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.